If you love it, how much do you love it? If you don't care, how little do you care? My name's Andrew Norman Wilson, and I'm an artist who works in video, sculpture, photography, performance, maybe some other things too.
Okay, Norman, very happy to welcome you here in Frankfurt for the double feature. And the film you decided to show today evening is Ode to the Seekers 2012. It's a loop, but it still consists of 3 parts. And the first part is the one where you go with a Steadicam in a building, and this building is the Rockland Psychiatric Center in Orangeburg, New York. That's right?
Right.
Tell me about how did you choose this location?
I was going to Rockland Psychiatric Center in 2012 for psychiatric testing, and I noticed this abandoned portion of the campus and eventually went back to explore it with some friends. And what I liked about it was that there are all these murals from the book Goodnight Moon, or Where the Wild Things Are, or Barney, the TV show, but also on top of that, graffiti by, teenagers, artists, junkies, homeless people that circulated through there. So it was an interior space with a surface that was sort of brimming with materiality. And I think there was something in that resonated with the surfaces of CGI that I was developing, which are so sleek, but developed to a point where they seem to be brimming with materiality, or sort of overflowing with an excess of visual information. And so that visual density and chaos of an exterior surface of a mosquito or an oil pump just seemed to play nicely with the interior penetration of this psychiatric center.
So basically what you is doing is creating kind of a trance movement through this continuous penetration of this surface. You are kind of celebrating these mosquito syringes, and they signify threats. We all wear it, as for example, illnesses, diseases, addictions, or kind of danger coming out of industry. But also there is kind of obsessive mechanism.
I was reading a lot about romantic poetry and their form of aestheticism. In particular, I was looking at John Keats' poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. He uses a literary technique called ekphrasis, which is sort of based in an ecstatic form of repetition, that you almost become the object through reading it. And it allows you to kind of embrace your objecthood. And I really liked that idea and that approach. And I think the ecstasy that I felt when I started to figure out the composition through editing it was basically just like a translation of these techniques of romantic poetry into a video format. And I think that was geared towards creating a feeling in the viewer that there's not much that differentiates them from an oil pump jack or a mosquito. So it's a way of almost creating identification with these objects.
I
So instead of making an obvious condemnation or critique of oil production or drug addiction, it becomes a celebration. The viewer is asked, if you love it, how much do you love it? If you don't care, how little do you care? And so on.
What I found quite interesting is that what actually happens in the third part of this film is that the color of the objects that lie on an assembly line apparatus has been sucked out. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Well, I guess Ode to Seekers ends with a sort of exhausted, mechanical, repetitive sequence where all of these 3D models of containers, like an engine, return to a more default mode where color and texture aren't applied, and it just looks like clay. But I didn't want it to seem like a death, so I made the video an infinite loop so that you end up where you started. Or in the case of an installation of the work, you don't really know where you're starting. You're sort of just caught in this closed loop of thought and desire and seeking until it's unplugged. So I like to think of it as not having an end except for when it's unplugged. And I think that is maybe an analogy for consciousness.
In your early artistic practice, you were rather directly involved in the market. For example, there is a film you did 2011 called Working Living the Googleplex, and this was also related to you actually working at the Google company. Your recent work is quite different than that. Why that?
Well, I came from that world before becoming an artist. And as I made the transition into being an artist, it was sort of my material. And so I was producing video content for Google at their headquarters, using stock imagery and uploading things to stock image websites. And so I started to make work that dealt with those economies of production. And I think eventually it started to feel like ineffectual satire. Maybe not so much the Googleplex project, but other projects that I developed afterwards seemed to operate strictly within the closed loop of what I like to call the cottage industry of critical art. A very small subset of humans on Earth that are trained to pick up cues and have the appropriate perspective to read work that emerges out of the tradition of conceptual art and institutional critique. I started to notice a lot of art, mine included, that just seemed to be taking new journalistic content and, on the one hand, operating as journalism, but then just kind of taking gestures and forms of display from conceptual art and applying them to this content. It felt like I was a designer as opposed to an artist. I don't really have like a romantic conception of what it means to be an artist, but I do think that art does something special that other fields can't do because it doesn't have to be held to a bottom line, if you're lucky. And it doesn't have to solve a problem. So I believe there's a big distinction to be made between journalism and art, or activism and art. And there are certain projects that deal with those other fields through art, but a lot of what I was trying to do and a lot of what I see seems to think that the way out of art's lack of influence in the world is to take practices from other fields and stage those techniques or practices within the realm of art. But a lot of my attempts to do that just left me feeling defeated and maybe even less impactful And so now the work is more difficult to pin down. I think a lot of what I'm interested in operates on a precognitive level. It gets at you before you can think. It's still structured by thought, but it's much more like poetry than branding. In a way, it's like a potential viewership is imagined. And that's who the work is for.
Thank you, Norman.